for this webinar, we're going to be trying to make some sense of what's happening with the fossil gas industry in those times of global pandemic. We're going to hear from three speakers, Anna Vickerstaff, Victor criollo, and Nicolas Ehringer. So Anna Vickerstaff is the UK lead campaigner at 350. She was involved in the grassroots resistance against the fracking industry for several years, and she's currently working on targeting central banks and their role in a just recovery by working to get UK financial flows to oversee fossil fuel projects and extractivism to stop. Victor criollo is part of the Observatorio Petrolero Sur in Argentina. One of the main tasks of this group is to accompany the territorial resistance against fracking mega project known as Vaca Muerta. And this project involves 4 provinces in the northern Patagonia region and is located in a populated area and indigenous traditional lands. And finally, we have Nicolas Ehringer, who is global organizer at 350 and has been involved in the global justice movement since the early 2000s. So without further ado, we're going to start with Nicolas, who will talk us through a little bit an overview of what the fossil gas and fossil fuel industry is up to in those times of pandemic, and how this industry is trying to kind of seize the moment to make profit out of it. So Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Sure. Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? Cool. I mean, I think it's the first thing is that it's obviously hard to overstate the political importance of the period, and I'm saying this acknowledging that this is a sentence that I somehow hate because it's been used so many times to, you know, dismiss other struggles and say my struggle or our struggle is more important than any other. But I come back to that toward the end. But what is real is that, you know, if we compare the outcomes of a recovery that would you know, be very carbon intensive based on pouring money into the fossil fuel industry on the one hand, and on the other hand, a recovery that would be grounded in justice. So on the one hand, you know, like getting back to business as usual, and on the other hand, building back better, the impact or the difference of the impact of the two approaches will last not only for decades but for centuries. And it's basically the moment where we will either decide to completely, definitely, you know, give up on the 1.5 objective, or still try and fight for it. So this is a moment of truth both for the climate justice movement and for the fossil fuel industry. And, you know, within the climate justice movement, we've been very often mocked, or we've very often also made fun of our own selves, right? Saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to figure out a future that would be liberated from extractivism and capitalism. And this is basically this kind of moment that we are living in. But it also means that the industry, the fossil fuel industry, is engaged as well in a fight for its life. And they're like deploying all their resources, all their money into making sure that they can get back to business as usual. They can even scale up, dig deeper, drill further, and build more pipelines, refineries, etc. And one of the strongest resources of the fossil fuel industry is what is now very well known as the shock doctrine, right? Using a crisis as an opportunity to do things that would be harder to do under, so to say, normal circumstances. And that's clearly visible everywhere, right? In the south of Italy, TAP is being built despite the pandemic. and with no protests. In the US, some prominent politicians have said that this is the moment where Keystone should eventually be built. And like there are like many places where we're talking about like opening new coal mines, opening new pits. And yes, obviously we cannot on our side take the streets. We cannot fight back. What's a bit weird also is that at the same time we are going through like a brutal interruption of business as usual. Planes are grounded, cars remain parked. Half of the industry, at least, is being under temperature shutdown. So it could look like the system change we've been calling for years is happening now. And there are some people in the climate movement who've been saying that, right? That the pandemic is a wake-up call. That the pandemic is Gaia sending us a message, and that this is rather good news. Some have even trying to count, like the lives that have been saved because of the air pollution drop to the lives that have been lost to the pandemic. And they say, if we compare it, actually more lives have been saved than lost. And so I think like we have to fight two different things. We have to fight the industry, the fossil fuel industry, and their plan out of the crisis. But we have also to fight this toxic narrative that the pandemic would be good news somehow, because it definitely doesn't look like an agenda that is rooted in justice. There are like, despite the fact that the industry is seizing the moment, despite the fact that we cannot take the streets or the fields or occupy coal mines or block construction sites, I think there are a few good news, however, in the period. The first one is that the fossil fuel industry, despite everything I said, is weaker than it has ever been. It will depend more than ever on money coming from the state. There are some actors of the industry who will just go bankrupt, which is a unique opportunity to socialize them or to nationalize them. And there are some actors who are strong enough not to go bankrupt, but they will lose some of their strengths. So this is probably one of the very few moments where states can potentially, theoretically, stand up to them and impose on them some conditions. They cannot hide any longer behind the excuse that the fossil fuel industry is too strong, is a giant that they cannot, impose on them anything. Otherwise, they would just, go elsewhere, but keep on doing the same thing. Then they would, and if they would move elsewhere, then the state would lose money. The second thing is usually in like lots of climate actors, including lots of mainstream NGOs, tend to consider that oil has to be expensive for the transition to be possible. That the most expensive the oil is, the higher the incentive to house insulation, building electric cars, or whatever other technology we could imagine to solve as I said, the climate crisis would become interesting, right? It would be then cheaper to renovate housing than to use fuel as a heating system. And so lots of people do believe that we need an expensive barrel in order to build the transition. But I think the reality has proven this analysis to be wrong, because whenever the barrel is high, then the industry actually invests in new drilling operations, because they are not because they're just, they can make money out of them, right? So a cheap barrel price is actually very good news for the climate. So I think it's like, rather than trying to wait for the barrel to increase again and to reach more than $100, I think we should not celebrate, but at least organize around the fact that oil has kind of reached its true price. The real price of oil is basically the price it has now, right? Because from a climate standpoint, we have too much oil. Like currently, oil is cheap because consumption has dropped. and production cannot drop as much as the consumption. You cannot, shut down a drilling site just by clicking on a button. So we have too much oil and not enough consumption, so the price drops. But from a climate standpoint, we actually have way too much oil. Oil is overabundant. It's not a rare resource. It's a fairy tale to say that oil is rare and that we have reached, the peak in production. We do have way too much oil. So the real price of oil should be what it is now, 0 or almost 0. It's not a good that should be traded. It's not a good that should be profitable. It is a good that should be not, that no one should make money out of it. So this is the true price of oil, and this is actually the good moment to then do the third thing that we need to do, which is stop money flows, right? And I think that's an important thing, because like in the conversation about stimulus packages, the industry, and it's not just the fossil fuel industry, it's also the airline industry, the car industry, all the polluting industry are asking governments to give them money. And they say, officially, they're open to negotiate some counterparts to it, which is obviously false. There are no counterparts. Like in France, for instance, Air France has received several millions from the state. And officially, the counterpart was for Air France to shut down all the domestic flights that are connecting cities that are connected by train in less than 2 hours and a half, which is already, as such, it is bullshit, right? Because most cities that are connected by flights in France are actually distant by 3 hours, not 2 hours and a half. So it means like shutting down maybe 2 or 3 lines, no more. But then the other thing that Air France has done is just transfer those flights to KLM. So actually, Air France will keep on operating those flights just under a new name. So there are no conditions attached to that. So, which like the point is that any conversation that is just about flows of money going, like stimulus packages, pouring money into an industry, are biased because the industry will do whatever it can to make sure that the conditionalities and the counterparts are as small as possible, and that they can bypass them. So what's important, and the current price of the barrel is a great opportunity to do that, is to first begin with stopping the money flows. Right? It's not about like figuring out in which sector we want to invest. It begins with from which sector do we want to divest. And so stopping pouring money into the fossil fuel industry, into the airline industry, into the car industry is actually decisive. And I would say that it goes actually beyond fossil fuels or the airline industry or the car industry. It's probably like the moment where we can put every type of money flow on the table. This is the moment where we could, put into question subsidies, debt and debt services, tax exemptions, and yeah, when I'm saying debt, I'm not only thinking about like private debt or household debt or student debt, but the debt from the south, right? This is the moment where we should say, let's stop all the existing fossil money flows and look into how do we want to reorientate them towards building it back better, toward a just recovery. And the last thing I want to highlight as like maybe a strategy or a perspective to try and make sure that while the fossil fuel industry is leading the fight for its life, we don't lose, is coming back to this idea that this is hard to overstate the importance of the moment, yet not give up on other struggles. I think the answer to that, like what the pandemic has shown us, is that the usual way we look at social transformation is flawed, right? Usually, when we look at social transformation, we consider that we have 3 different timescales. One is the short term, in the current case, it's the health emergency. The second one is like the midterm, the midterm timescale. So in the current case, it's the green stimulus packages. And then the third timescale is a longer timescale of social transformation, in this case, the transition. But actually what the pandemic is showing is that every time we're forced or trapped into deciding which timescale is more important than the other, people die. And so probably the first answer to the pandemic, and the first like strategic shift we need to operate to fight the industry back as much as we can is to refuse to have to choose between those timescales, and thus to to put the issue of care at the core of any strategy that we are developing. And so I think this is also the moment where actually putting care at the center of the climate movement, putting care at the center of the resistance against the fossil fuel industry, is really, really important. And it's not about like hallucinated version of care that would just be about we're all equal, we need unity more than ever. This is a sense of care that can really be rooted into anger, the anger for all the lives that have been lost to the pandemic, the anger for all the lives that have been lost to the fossil fuel industry, the anger for all the lives that have been lost to air pollution, but to center really all our demands, all our approach to build it back better or to just recovery into care for each and one another, and so not give up on the importance of the moment, yet at the same time not sacrificing any other struggle. So this is probably, if this is a wake-up call, this is probably a wake-up call in the sense that there is no way we can fight against the fossil fuel industry without centering justice, centering care, and having an intersectional approach to our struggle.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nicolas. If you have any questions for Nicolas, maybe just make a note of them. We'll go to a Q&A section at the end of the speaker slots. But thank you very much, Nicolas. So we're now gonna go and hear from Victor. So we wanted to get a perspective on, to go from the overview that we got from Nicolas to a bit of a more on-the-ground perspective, and hear from frontline resistance, and specifically how COVID-19 has been impacting the struggle in Vaca Muerta. So without further ado, Victor, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Nicolas. Thanks, everyone. Very glad to be here sharing with you. Right now I'm in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and it's a beautiful morning. So great to start this morning, like talking this more in depth about what's going on and take some notes about the pandemic also, I would like to share some images we prepare for in case of these chats, and then focus on a couple of issues that are very related to what Nicolas just said, and what other campaign, other like action is developing right now. So give me a sec, please. Okay. It's okay now. Do you guys see this? Perfect. Okay. We have this. What do you see now? Here it's a oil dump. It's a waste dump oil from fracking industry right outside of Neuquén in Patagonia. I don't know how many of you are aware of this Vaca Muerta fracking oil and gas industries. So give me just 1 or 2 minutes to give some sense of this. How is this happening right now? For us, for Observatorio Petrolero Sur, OPSUR, Vaca Muerta is more than a geological formation or a dream about cheap energy or high cost energy. It's also a mega project on a carbon bomb. It's the second tight gas reserve from 4 shale oil reserves in according to the EA. It's in the middle of 3 provinces. It's like 30,000 kilometers squares, and it involves 5 provinces where a lot of people live, and it's a huge place. This is a mega project where a lot of companies, all of us are really well related and aware of, are participating. This map might be, it's a little change, has a little changes. But for us, Vaca Muerta is a mega project. We call it as a mega project because it involves from Atlantic to Pacific installation of infrastructure. It's not only a good and cheap gas, fossil gas, as Gastivists says, but it's also a mega project which links the Buenos Aires to Santiago or Concepción in Chile. Also implies financial and economic policies regarding foreign economical markets. This image, it's from a recent report we have with numbers from January 2020 on Vaca Muerta, and what we saw from last year is Vaca Muerta as a project it's a very huge and expensive fracking project for gas and oil. And from the past 8 years, the policies on subsidies to boost the economics on fracking, it stopped on 2019. I mean, last year. Even though the participation of Vaca Muerta and non-conventional in the gas and oil extraction in Argentina was still very high. So in January 2020, all you can see this, like this is the rough number, and 42% of gas and 20% of total oil extraction in Argentina. If you want this report, I can send you the full document. On the same report, we've been looking this, on this evolution of the production and the incidence was escalating from 2015, 2012. It's a very important year because of a process of nationalization and then sign of agreements among YPF and Chevron. From 2015 to last year, this was mainly the composition on companies in gas and oil extraction in Vaca Muerta. As you can see, there's no huge participation of the big fives. And what you can see is YPF along new actors as Tech Petrol and Gas in the 2019 slide. You can see this being a full inversion of state money, and then a new market for newly arriving, but very connected people. Tech Petrol is a company founded by Galuccio, who was an ex-CEO of YPF. So the larger company on gas exploitation, distribution, and selling in Argentina, that's YPF, share with private companies the full investment in fracking. This leads to this, Of course, we all know, the exploitation, the menace on water. This lake, it's the heart of of fresh water for Neuquén City. You have also conflicts with Mapuche communities. Campo Maripe, it's a very well-known case because of oil industry, specifically fracking. Then also you have the superposition, you know, like now they pushing the fracking industry over lands who were previously dedicated to fruit and vegetables. So they are selling this discourse. Of course, we all hear about that. It's compatible with other activities, gas extraction, and it's right next to cities. All of this, it's right next to cities. It's not in the middle of nothing, of nowhere. For markets, Vaca Muerta is in the middle of nowhere because the project without infrastructure. There's no pipelines and no train from the valleys to the coast. Where's the plants for, you know, export? The oil dumps, water city, you know. Also, is a lot of resistance from Mapuche organizations nowadays with the pandemics. This is, of course, has very low intensity, but the communities are still in the locations and regaining lands. You know, there's also a project. A project we planned alongside with other organizations to present the case of Vaca Muerta in the Inter-American system of human rights. So this year we're working on this, recounting this long-time memory of this specific resistance in the heart of Vaca Muerta. You have also a lot of mobilizations. Right now, nowadays, I mean, up to March, the country was in the fields. In the people of Mendoza, in northern Vaca Muerta province, they were able to stop a law that was allowing the development of fracking in a almost dry province because of water. But there's a lot of organization in the field, and what's going on now is that everybody is on their homes now, and also there's a lot of militarization on the fields and the provinces. Also, even in the cities, you know, in pandemic control, they are taking measures on controlling movement, people's movement, and there's also a radicalization of the discourse on hygienic and public health, pointing also to popular sectors. So it's not an easy times in the fields. Alongside with this, oil industry is pushing forward to out everywhere else. You know, the most important, and with this is my final comment. One of the most important political now and public discussions was the local price. What for how much money will the state pay for the production of oil in Argentina? And this is a very heavy political matter because a few days ago, government says it's $45 barrel. All of us know that's a higher price than the public market of oil. So but why is the government doing this? You know, and we've been giving a lot of discussion on this. For us, specifically, it's a debate on what Nicolas says about pricing the oil. This is a specific conflict that is derivated from this very particular momentum on pricing. You know, pricing the oil right now is not a subsidy direct on the oil industries. It looks like really is that, you know, but also it's money for the provinces where the oil is. Where the oil is. You know, in Argentina, all the states, the provinces, tax the exploitation of oil and gas and minery, etc. A royalty, you know. When central government says, okay, we're going to pay $45 each barrel, it's because 12% of that is going to the provinces. The halt of the activity in Vaca Muerta, it's almost full. So there's been a lot of firing. There's been a lot of poverty increasing, and also a heavily in-depth problem of Argentina and Neuquén particularly. So it's a very, very, very delicate and sharp moment on this discussion. If you want, we can round this in Q&A, or if you think we need more details on what you have seen, or maybe I wasn't so clear because you know, I'm not an English speaker native. I speak Spanish, so for me it's very important to share for us. I mean, it's very important to share what's going on because it links, of course, all of our organizations, and also gives our work in the fields a connection sense of what's going on other fields from other languages even. So very, very good. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Victor. So you'll get a chance to ask any questions that you might have for Victor in a minute. But before that, we're going to get to our third and last speaker. So we heard a little bit about what's happening with COVID and the fossil gas industry. And now we're going to try to project a bit more and hear from Anna Vickerstaff on what a just recovery could and should look like. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lise, and thanks to the other two speakers. I want to start what I'm going to say with a bit of a caveat, which is that hopefully it's obvious, but I don't think that the vision or the solutions of what a just recovery looks like is going to come from a white person in the UK. I think what we're seeing right now is that the systems that have come out of white Western thought, namely capitalism, financialization of our economies, white supremacy, colonialism, they're manifesting right now in the impacts of both COVID-19 and also the climate crisis. So to suggest that the same minds, systems should be leading the solutions is definitely wrong. And I think hopefully we're all in agreement that the solutions, the knowledge, collaboration, compassion needed to properly recover is best found in communities who have been building resilience in the face of systemic and systematic injustice for decades and more. You know, whether that's talking about Indigenous, Global South, frontline communities and their knowledge in other parts of the world or in the UK, centering Black and working class communities in shaping the recovery. That says that isn't a get out of jail free card for everyone else, and doesn't mean that we get to sit back and not be active in recovery work. And I think that those of us with organisational privilege and the people who have the luxury of not being on the front lines right now and have the headspace to be thinking about further down the line should be using our resources to hold space for the communities who have the knowledge, have the lived experience to shape the solutions. And we should be doing that through practical solidarity, short-term interventions. Like Nico was talking about the timescales of intervention in Corona, and I think there's work that needs to be done quickly that we can do as allies, work really well on in terms of how we respond to bailouts, etc. But the longer-term work of shaping a vision for economic reform or community-owned solutions to things, that work needs to centre communities who right now are maybe on the front line of the impacts of coronavirus. So it's a balancing act between how we are proactive allies in short-term interventions and how we hold space in the longer-term conversations and organising that's happening. Hopefully that makes sense. In terms of broadly what a just recovery means, 350's global team are part of a huge mesh of people that are starting to throw around the phrase just recovery, and for 350 at a global level we see that as broadly existing in the 5 principles. We recognise that a just recovery isn't going to be the same everywhere, but that the principles that we put forward should hopefully be universal. The first one of those is putting people's health first, and that's no exception. So making sure that healthcare access to basic needs is available to everyone, regardless of immigration status, etc. And that should be a universal right to health. Similarly, providing economic relief directly to people, and that sort of feeds into the third demand as well, where making sure that as economic recovery and bailouts, etc., are happening, they're centering workers and communities and not corporate executives. So making sure that not only where the money is going, but how the money is going to companies is centering people rather than profit. Creating resilience for future crises is obviously intrinsic to a just recovery, and making sure that what we're doing now in both short-term and long-term thinking about preventing another health pandemic or recovering from corona is factoring in resilience for the climate crisis, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And then the final one is building solidarity and communities across borders, and specifically not empowering authoritarians, and recognising that this is a global crisis, and because of that our solutions have to be global. And I think that's something that is, again, a place where in a short-term way, those of us with more organisational privilege can be acting as allies at the moment. So Nico's talked a bit about what's happening with fossil fuel companies and covered at the moment, but I just wanted to recap a few points that I think are really important. And as I was saying before, talking about the timescales we have in terms of short-term interventions versus long-term interventions, one of the real risks that we're seeing at the moment in terms of bailouts is that if conditions aren't attached to those in the right way, and at the same time recognising that smaller fossil fuel companies are going bankrupt, which on paper sounds great, but for lots of reasons, whether that's workers' rights, etc., it's actually terrible. And one of the risks that comes with that is that bigger companies can absorb those smaller companies and essentially get more power. So if we're not being strategic, sensible, putting pressure on decision makers, on central banks, and looking at how relief is being provided to companies, we're not only at risk of them carrying on business as usual, we're actually at risk of them getting more powerful. And that's something that we, in the short term, we definitely need to be worried about. I think other things that we need to be thinking about right now is in terms of frontline resistance. We've heard, some of our tactics are gone, basically. Like, it's true to say that the resistance to fracking in the UK was won through a variety of tactics, and it was a case of throwing everything possible at that fight for it to have a victory, whether that was interventions in the planning system, holding public meetings, legal cases, but that win wouldn't have happened without direct action and without people on the ground. And right now that tactic has sort of been removed from us, and we have Sonia Savage, the Alberta Energy Minister, saying now is the perfect time to be building a pipeline, because protests can't happen, and that's something that we really need to be thinking about how we respond to. And similarly, we're hearing reports that whilst the global eye is looking at the coronavirus pandemic, fossil fuel companies are using that that sort of shadow to carry on encroaching on indigenous territories around the world. Like particularly, we're hearing lots of reports of that happening in deforestation of the Amazon. So these are all things that we need to be thinking about in short-term responses. Yeah, and I'm sure many of you are also aware that companies and governments are continuing to push ahead with other pipeline constructions in Europe and in Africa, and a lot of it is business as usual, with some of our tactics for resistance taken away from us, which is really scary. I think that's really interesting, and this is a very UK-centric statistic, but it would be interesting to see how it reflects in other spaces, is that it does seem like climate has taken a backseat in the agenda of governments and banks in terms of the response. But actually, in terms of public opinion, 2 out of 3 people in the UK see climate as serious as the coronavirus pandemic, and think that the solutions to coronavirus should be incorporating climate solutions, which gives us as organisers, as communicators, scope to carry on talking about climate, and that not being seen as insensitive or missing the mark. And I think that's a really important thing for us to know in terms of mobilising, is that we can still talk about climate, and we should still be talking about climate, and ordinary people, not just activists, are making the links between the two crises, and that's something that we shouldn't be backing away from now for fear of getting it wrong. So in terms of what a just recovery looks like for the fossil gas industry, it's sort of a weird question. And I guess if we were looking at, emissions wise, what does recovery look like for the climate crisis and the fossil gas industry? And the short answer is, just get rid of it. Like we don't want there to be a fossil gas industry is the short-term answer. But in terms of a just recovery and centering justice, actually it's not about whether it exists, but it's how we move away from there being a fossil gas industry, and getting that wrong, and not embedding the right solutions and the right approach could actually repeat the same systems that we've been trying to avoid during our fight against the fossil gas industry from the start. I think the first thing that I've sort of touched on this before, but that we should be doing in just recovery to fossil gas and thinking about what recovery looks like, is putting time and resources into frontline fights now, and recognising that, and I don't just mean against gas, I mean that recognising that a lot of the frontline impacts and injustices of coronavirus are being felt by the exact same communities that feel first and worst the impacts of the climate crisis. And now more than ever, we have a role to step up and be active allies in those fights. So in fights about workers' rights, in fights about housing, in fights about migrant rights, and making sure they have access to healthcare in our countries, and recognising the links between migration and climate. Those are really important things that we should be doing, as well as the kind of technical responding to bailouts, where we might be saying that, okay, we're not saying don't bail out any fossil fuel companies completely, because that would mean that loads of workers are losing all of their jobs, but we are saying that there are conditions attached to how ownership of that ownership of that company exists in the longer term. I mean, there's some places where we would say no bailouts completely, obviously. And I think one thing that we really need to be aware of is solutions that are working for people and not for, as we talked about before, not just for profit. There was an article the other day saying that a really quick solution for raising funds for recovery from corona and for the climate crisis would be a fuel tax. And I'm laughing because, I mean, it went down so well in France that why not roll it out elsewhere? And I think we're seeing consistently that there is a tendency to not put tax on big companies, on CEOs, and the solutions that are supposed to be climate centric are still costing people. So we need to make sure that we're fighting against solutions that don't work for people and that are propping up profit margins of big CEOs. We also need to be talking about, if we are talking about shutting down the fossil gas industry, that's definitely what we want. It can't just be a cold cut off, it has to be a transition. And a really key part of that is making sure that the transition with good unionised jobs in sectors that nourish our environment, our economy and our society. And I think a really important metric of that is quite often people talk about, oh, we need 1 million climate jobs. But actually, what does that? It does not ever really clear what that means. And if we talk at the US a few years ago, did a really good job of massively boosting its employee statistics by providing loads of really crap jobs. And they were able to say, look at all these jobs we have, but actually none of those jobs were dignified, none of those jobs were unionised, there were no rights attached to that employment. And so we have to ask the question that, you know, you're saying you're going to provide 40 new jobs, but if those 40 new jobs are in a company are 0-hour contracts, there's no access to unions, there's no workers' rights, is that actually better than one 40-hour-a-week full-time position where unionisation is guaranteed? So it's about creating meaningful and dignified employment, not just boosting numbers of employment. I think a huge thing for countries in the global north and with a lot of financial power at the moment is cutting off finance flows. There was a new report from Oil Change International and Friends of the Earth that's revealed that G20 countries have provided at least $77 billion a year in public finance to oil, gas and coal since the Paris Agreement. And we're seeing in how bailouts are happening, how things like quantitative easing are happening for companies at the moment, that's not changing. And in the UK specifically, we've been targeting the Bank of England to remove fossil fuel companies from some of their lines of support, and also aviation companies, and we're seeing really recently that that's not happening. So they're not adjusting the way they're providing relief to companies to meet the climate crisis, and that's something that we really need to push back on in the short term. And then the final thing that I think we definitely need to be thinking about is when we're talking about building global solidarity, it's like, what does that actually mean in practical terms? Like, solidarity is a nice concept, but practically, what does it mean? And we might want to be cutting off finance flows to fossil fuel projects overseas, but I think there's definitely some other flows of finance that need to be opened up in the form of reparations, in the forms of funding solutions and taking account of our historic role in the climate crisis. We need to be sharing knowledge and solutions, recognising that our knowledge and solutions might not necessarily be the best ones, but when they are working, making sure we're sharing them. And also thinking about things like freedom of movement as a climate adaptation strategy, and something that we have to be open to if we are truly talking about global solidarity. We have to see the movement of people as something that shouldn't be a consequence of climate change, but that is an adaptation strategy that we have to accept. A final thing that I wanted to, well, two final things I want to talk about. One is something to bear in mind, and then a question around how we organise on this together at the moment in the current context. Something that we need to be really mindful of is what I would say at best is greenwashing and at worst is eco-fascism, and the co-option and adoption of the just recovery narrative is bound to happen. We're already having companies like BP talk about going net zero. We're having BHP mining saying that mining is a key ingredient to a Green New Deal. So the narratives that we're using about talking about recovery, about solutions, are being adopted by big companies and also by the far right. There's a real danger in the way we're talking about the recovery to coronavirus that people will use the fact that we've had to close borders to protect ourselves from this pandemic as an ongoing thing to keep borders closed, and to talk about movement as a dangerous thing. And we need to be really prepared to fight against, as I said, both greenwashing and eco-fascism, and make sure that we're not allowing just recovery to become a phrase that's thrown around fossil fuel company board meetings. So in terms of how we're organised together, as I said, some of our tactics have been taken away from us. Physical blockades don't seem that realistic for the upcoming period. Some people have been doing blockades. I think it's important to recognise that there are still people doing physical blockades, not only around fossil fuel projects, but also around people in detention centres who are currently at most risk from coronavirus. But it is about thinking how we move some of our tactics online, how we organise online, and how we connect with each other online, and recognising that there are issues with that, because organising online and access to the technology to do that is also a privilege. So it's how are we connecting with the most impacted communities when in a way, the way we're able to communicate is slightly elitist and is a privileged thing. I also think there's a question about staying in our lane, and I think there's a real phrase that's thrown around climate NGOs that's like, what's our unique selling point? What's our unique role in this movement? And actually, I think at this point, there is a point to be made about making sure that we are using our skills and flexing our best abilities, but not talking about things that we don't see as directly relevant is actually something that's really dangerous. And we need to more and more be linking up the different injustices, different oppressions that exist in our society, and being more active allies in how we're talking about them. As I said, there's also a question around the speed that we're working at. We do, like, in a state of emergency, the reaction is always to speed up, to go quicker, to go harder. But the reality is that this isn't going to slow down anytime soon. The coronavirus pandemic is a tiny glimpse into the future of what is going to be an enormous economic crash and in kind of terrifying scale. And then the climate crisis is coming further down the line, right? So in reality, we're not going to go back to normal, and we don't want to go back to normal, but that also means that the way we're organising and the way we're working can't maintain the same speed that we might normally do in a reactive moment. So we need to make sure that we're slowing down, not only to make sure that we're incorporating the right people into our organising, but also in terms of building resilience into our communities and into our activism. Resilience, like connections with people, is always the stuff that gets dropped when you're in times of urgency. I think we probably all can think of a time when we've been doing an action and they're like, taking care of one another bit is the bit that gets dropped when you're like running at whatever you're running at. But there's a lot of running that needs to be done, and actually if we walk there with more people, then we're going to have better solutions than a few of us out of breath and panting. So yeah, I think, as I said, there's definitely things that we can be doing actively right now. We do need to be responding to bailouts. We need to be looking at the immediate stimulus programs that are coming out of governments in terms of how they think they're going to reshape the economy. But I think in terms of longer term visions of what the future looks like, it's not for us to decide. It's for us to hold space, open the conversations out, and remind ourselves that going slowly doesn't mean that we won't get there. Thanks.
Amazing, thank you, Anna, and thanks again to all three of you. That was really, really inspiring and comprehensive and useful. We now have a bit of time for some questions. So if anyone wants to come in to ask a question, you can just put a star in the chat box like this. If you're feeling a bit shy, you don't want to ask it in front of everyone, you can just type it and I'll ask it for you. Yeah, feel free to just pop a star in or a question if you have any. Johannes?
Question.
Yes, hi. Johannes from Denmark here, and now with video. I'm working on a Danish divestment campaign, and we have had some success with getting our pension fund to divest from oil and coal. So now we're working on getting them to divest from gas. And obviously at the moment, as you also stressed earlier on, the coronavirus has made the oil prices and most of the fossil fuel prices go down, which makes the investments into fossil fuel companies look worse from an investor point of view, which is a good case for doing divestment. I was wondering if you know or have any feelings about what the specific scene looks like for the fossil gas industry. I mean, how the coronavirus has affected the gas industry specifically. If any of you have insights or reflections about that.
Thank you, Johannes. Do any of our speakers want to take this on? Try to give a bit of an answer on this. Victor, go for it.
Yes, mainly, thanks, Johannes. Mainly on the effects on coronavirus and gas industry in Argentina. It's related to the lower demand on gas and all the capacity installed in infrastructure for storage of gas. It's already full also. So the impact on this in this full stop of consumption but still production, some production, was very intense on early March because of a crisis in the Russian Saudi and the States. In Argentina, when the economy because of coronavirus stopped, it was almost a full stop in a couple of days. A lot of equipments in Neuquén and partially Rio Negro almost fully stopped, and the price obviously dropped, and it was accompanied because of the WTI crash prices on the futures oil market. You know, it's not really linked to the gas industry, but all the signals from the sector for the oil and gas industry during this pandemic was like almost we saw like almost a lethal in the early stages of pandemic here, at least in Argentina, is almost like the final hit to the industry. But during the course of the events, we're seeing signs of recovery on oil markets, oil prices, and the gas indicators, at least in Argentina, are almost fully stopped. Vaca Muerta is going to reconvert to the we're thinking like to the local markets, to the national scale and regional scale, but we'll have to wait at least 1 or 2 years up to the oil market, at least in terms of sales from Argentina. It's open. I don't know, you guys in Europe, how do you see us as a very important buying sector, the gas?
Thank you, Victor. Anna, Nicolas, do you want to add anything on this?
I can say a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not a secret that fossil fuel industries in general have taken a huge financial blow from the coronavirus pandemic, and you can see that in the way that they're requesting support, and where they're requesting support from isn't always transparent, but we know that they are doing it from some places. Smaller companies are, as I said, at risk of completely folding altogether, but as I said, there's a risk of then that being absorbed into bigger companies who are more likely to withstand the pandemic. You know, and there's reports of in certain countries that the fracking industry, for example, is not gonna survive what is happening. So I think there's And I think that's only going to develop more and more over the coming months, and that's why we have to keep a really close eye to the relief that's being provided to those companies by governments, by banks, and especially kind of central public funds. So yeah, I think there's going to be plenty of economic justification that investing in gas right now is not just morally reprehensible, but it's also just economically a bit stupid. Having said that, I think in terms of where the divestment movement's been most successful in the UK, it definitely is bringing in that economic argument. And in some ways that feels a bit slimy, because it feels like that's not what we should be talking about. We should be talking about the justice principles. But when we're talking to trustees of pension funds, they care more about the economic impacts, right? So we do need to be talking in ways that maybe we don't see as morally the most important, but actually in terms of the leverage that we're getting, that's how we need to talk about things, unfortunately. But having said that, the biggest successes are where there is a combination of economic argument and public momentum. So you do still need to make sure you're prioritising that the people that are involved in the pension funds you're trying to change are saying this is what we want, and then you have the financial argument to back that up. So definitely don't just prioritise the economic arguments. They're a useful leveraging tool, but you do need that public pressure, public consensus, and the moral argument to be the sort of like final nail in the coffin.
Thanks, Anna. Nicolas, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe just two things. One is that this is actually like what happened over the last few weeks, especially when the price of the barrel dropped under the $0 is the moment that embodies what we've been saying about stranded assets. This is the moment where people have really realized what it can mean for the price of oil or gas to be worth nothing. And then the second thing is the difficulty for the gas industry, and it might be even more difficult for the gas industry than for the oil industry, is that it's not possible to turn off the tap. Once you've started to produce a field, you cannot stop it, right? There is no button or tap that you can click on or shut down. So you have to keep on producing and producing and producing. You can reduce sometimes the production, but like, especially with fracking, that's almost impossible to actually reduce the production. And it has highlighted the fact that oil and gas are definitely not compatible with the necessity of reducing production and consumption. And so that there is no way that we can use, like, I think it eventually is the final argument to dismiss gas as a transition energy. Because if it was really possible to consider it as a transition energy, then it would be the kind of resource that you can slowly reduce the production of, yet it's not possible. And so you are limited with two options. Like oil, at least you can store it, right? You produce it, but you can put it in a barrel. Oil, gas, so it's either it's consumed or you have to burn it. So whatever happens, whether it is used to heat or to produce energy or not, it is being burned and it produces CO2. So I think this should be really, the moment where we're done with the argument of gas as the energy transition.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, all three of you. Do we have any more questions for our speakers? Kira?
Hi, first of all, thank you so much to all the speakers. That was really, really interesting, all your different contributions. And a few of you mentioned you had quite a focus on resilience and how we need to rebuild societies that are going to be able to properly adapt to the climate crisis that we know is coming. And coming from a more Eurocentric viewpoint, a lot of the language I hear about people talking about just recovery, it's mostly about mitigation efforts, which is obviously really important. It's about saying, we need to invest in renewables now, and that all comes from a very good place. But I definitely see less of a consideration that actually, no, we need to look at adaptation as well. And I'm just wondering, do you have any ideas for how we can, just kind of gently introduce more of an adaptation and resilience focus as well, alongside all that focus on mitigation that I think a lot, well, particularly in in Europe anyway, the impression I get is that a lot of people are focusing on that side, and we need both, absolutely. But how do we kind of balance the discussion a bit? If you have any ideas for that, I'd be keen to hear them.
Thank you, Kira. Who wants to go first?
I can, if that's useful. Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and it's something I think about a lot. And I think if we're talking in Eurocentric terms, as you've kind of pitched the question, I think that the resistance to climate crisis and fossil fuels extraction, especially in the context of, you know, NGOs that are quite often dominated by white middle class staff, and similarly like bigger grassroots groups maybe have the same demographics. The response to doing activism and campaigning around fossil fuels in recent history has been about saying no to stuff, and it's been like, stop doing that, don't dig that up, don't set fire to that, don't build that, take that down, rather than being more progressive and visionary in what we're asking for. And there's definitely been the climate movement has sort of in some ways, and I mean by the climate movement I mean the way that white NGOs perceive themselves to be the climate movement in the UK especially, that they've been existing in a silo, and they haven't been working with grassroots campaigns, with trade unions, with communities who have been building resilience into their solutions for much longer, because they've been the people that have been experiencing the worst hardship of social, economic and climate injustice. And so I think a huge part of it is, I think what you're talking about is that there are people that aren't just talking about mitigation, but they're not the people with the platforms and the people with the voices. And actually, if you're thinking about wanting to talk to communities who are building resilience, it's a case of taking a step to pause and looking beyond the kind of usual suspects and asking questions and listening to the knowledge of communities who have been embedding resilience into their organising for ages. I think there's a really interesting thing that's happening globally. My experience of it is in the UK, in the form of how mutual aid networks have sprung up to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And it's a model that is, you know, rooted in radical history of Black people, of sex workers and of migrants who build support networks to support each other. And now more and more people are embedding themselves into these kind of small community groups and are listening to the kind of principles of embedding resilience into the way we organise in a more widespread way than that I've seen before in the UK. And I think that there's a tendency, there's a need, for campaigners who work at NGOs who've been saying no to stuff for ages, to recognise that this isn't an opportunity to just be saying no to stuff and to do the mitigation work. It is about having the headspace and the solutions to say, okay, we can think beyond saying no to stuff at this point. But to do that, we have to have the lead being given to people who have been thinking about more visionary solutions for longer. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Nicolas, Victor, either of you, both of you, want to come in on this? Yeah, Victor?
Okay, thanks. And very good question and answer also. I would like to add that currently crisis, past crisis, recently, not only pandemic, COVID-19 crisis, give a sense of forwarding, very fast forwarding in level of organizations and in sort of ranges we weren't really aware of. In the fields and in terms of organization was a very vigorous time, past months, and I'm sure it's not only in Argentina. We've seen that in many places. Because of this network we are working in, sometimes the line between the Eurocentric point of view, the colonial point of view, or the community point of view, it's a little blurred. because for example, it's not only affecting Mapuche communities. It's also affecting all of our lives committed together, you know. This point of view where everybody is affected because of this is very present. It's a political consensus in communities we are working with, and that we are part of also. And now, for at least a few, I don't know how long it's going to be this sense of we all affected by a pandemic, you know, but this simultaneous affectation on a lot of people that are facing this well, poor organized, or better organized, is part of this fast forward moment in political concept or reflection for stopping industries, very, very, very huge, like oil and gas industry. So for at least, you know, this pandemic and the current crisis, it's been pushing very hard against life integrity and authoritarian plans, and give us also a really clear sense of what has to be done, you know. And now we are discussing together this. And in some cases, for example, in Mendoza, as I shown, in Mendoza, they fully stopped a law that was allowing fracking in December, when new government in Argentina was just arrived to the power, you know. So it was the first demonstration against extractivism, against this popular movement, and it was a massive one, and they took advantage of all they know, but it was a really huge crisis in the horizon. Kind of, and they learning, you know, the curve of learning was so fast that moved forward all movement around fracking. Nowadays, we're talking about a more independent discussion on what we need to do to stop this industry. We are, of course, we have no clear success or a magical solution, you know, but fight for lands, fighting for rights, fighting for life, it's been, you know, very clear nowadays.
Thank you, Victor. Nicolas, you wanted to add something?
I just think maybe it's really about time to, you know, get rid of this distinction between mitigation and adaptation, because that's very often been used by, as Anna said, NGOs rooted in the North and governments, as a way to say, yeah, we'll focus on mitigation, which basically means commitments for the future, and at the cost of the here and now, and what's impacting and happening to people on daily life. And maybe that's also what the pandemic shows is, I mean, it's connected to the discussion on timescales, right? That you cannot any longer pretend that you're doing stuff for the future and at the cost of the here and the now. So maybe that's just also the moment where the climate movement should refuse that distinction, which is an abstract creation of the COP process, but doesn't mean anything in real life. And the only reason why we're still, you know, like talking about mitigation and adaptation is because it's written in the Rio Convention. But why should we adopt it if it doesn't match the reality of our lives and struggles?
Thank you, Nicolas. do we have any last burning question before we wrap up? Okay, in that case, maybe that means you just get 5 minutes more before another meeting or webinar or some kind of thing like this, I'm sure, which is always welcome. So I'm not going to keep you for the sake of keeping you. Before the weekend, I will be sending you a follow-up email where you'll get the recording from today and also the presentation from Victor. Thanks a million again to our 3 speakers. It was really inspiring and interesting. And thanks to everyone who made it as well. And I hope you all have a nice rest of the day.
Bye, many thanks.
Thanks a lot. Bye.